Hey everyone, welcome back to our channel SoftwareDude. Today we are going to dive into an important topic that plays a crucial role in modern software architecture. Right? This might be a critical topic in terms of there might be several viewpoints and opinions about how systems can be made, but I'll propose a situation or a pattern which can be considered, and I have seen some of the use cases where these kind of patterns are like these are really innovative in terms of thought process, because there probably 95% of the industry follows a standard pattern, but to think outside the box and actually build a separate pattern which can work in terms of when you are really designing systems that can scale and that can have diverse requirements, right? This is one of those topics, right? So it's a very creative topic. It's a not something that in today's world people generally think as the first choice in terms of architecture, but this really has benefits, right? So the topic that we are going to discuss is backend for front end pattern, right, which is often referred to as BFF. If you are involved in web or mobile app development, right, understanding how to optimize the communication between your front end and your back end is probably the most important and most key factor, right? And BFF pattern is basically here to help in that regard, right? So let's jump in. So backend for front end pattern. So let's start from, say you have a front end desktop, right? A client who uses a desktop for an application, and this is, say, your backend application, right? So the client who is using a desktop is calling and interacting with your backend, right? And then there is another client who is using a mobile view to access your backend, right? So for your backend system to operate and to be able to serve the needs of both the front end clients, right? So there can be diverse requirements, right? So for example, screen size, right? Then for example, performance, right? Depending on which systems and which machines they are using or which clients they are using, these can be diverse in terms of requirements, right? Display limitations, right? Like what do each device have in terms of display, right? There can be a browser setting depending on if you are using an application which is on a desktop browser, then how and which browser does it support, right? So these are like various diverse perspective of, now if you're building a backend service, you have to think about all these aspects, because you obviously want your backend service to scale and to reach as many users as possible, right? So how do you solve this problem? So in the current world, most of the time how we design systems and backend systems is primarily that we go ahead and build a single backend, right? And that single backend can basically is API based, and that can be a SOAP based. It's RESTful or SOAP APIs, which are integrated with different front end applications, like we have shown in this diagram, right? And they can access, I mean, it's a single backend which primarily has multiple clients and it can serve traffic to all the clients, and the backend is only responsible for the backend areas, right? Now the core business logic of the application, right? Which is good and which works for several cases. But how do you solve these diverse requirements? That is where the backend for front end pattern comes in, right? So the backend for front end pattern is an architectural pattern that basically involves creating a separate backend service for each front end application or front end client, right? So this approach is particularly useful in scenarios where different front end applications have diverse requirements, right? And one size fits all backend might not be the most efficient solution, right? So when you are designing a system, this is one of the angles. And in today's world where there are like so many devices and so many front end clients that use your backend application, this is something to consider when you are designing a system. Okay, it's a choice. It's a choice when you are designing. So again, I have repeated in several of my videos, a design choice is, it's all about trade-offs, right? There is no right or wrong or black and white answer. It's a trade-off, right? And what fits your requirement is what you should go ahead with, right? So this approach basically allows you to fine tune your backend logic to match the specific needs of each front end, right? I don't know if you guys remember, I think there was a an application when this entire app mobile app development world started about 7, 8, 10 years back. There were several applications who were moving to a app only interface, right? They were not supporting websites, right? And if you go to a website, they'll automatically redirect you to their app, and which works because to this. So now think of a scenario where you had built the system for the website to operate, and now if there is a separate app that will be accessing, or separate device who will be accessing the website from a mobile device, right? So in those kind of situations where there are very specific requirements, very diverse requirements, this architecture is a really, I felt, a creative architecture to think about when we are designing, right? So which basically uh, helps you to promote a more, modular and efficient system, right? So what are the characteristics and benefits, right? So let's look at the advantages. First of all, single responsibility, right? It basically should apply a microservices architecture, right? In a traditional monolithic architecture, single backend server might serve multiple front end applications, right? However, the backend for front end pattern promotes a single responsibility for each backend service, right? So which is focusing on the needs of a specific front end application or a client, right? This basically allows the developers to tailor their backend logic to match the requirements of the corresponding front end client, right? Next is, it is optimized for front end needs, right? BFSs are designed to optimize the data and functionality needed by a particular front end, right? So this can involve like tailoring APIs, aggregating data from multiple sources, right? Pre-processing data to reduce the amount of work required by the front end, right? So different, if you have a data table, if you have a list view, chart, graphs, like how do they show up on different devices, right? So your one API serving all kinds of data for all kinds of devices might not always work, right? So in that case, this is basically optimized for your front end needs, right? So decoupling front end and back end, right? I mean, this is obviously very important. I mean, wherever you have tight coupling, there is a possibility of cascading failures, right? So by having dedicated backend for each front end, um, teams can work more independently. I mean, it's also a segregation in terms of responsibility, ownership, scaling, right? I mean, there are decision making that can also be done at a team level, at a ownership level. And then front end and back end development can progress at different rates, right? Because without affecting each other, right? Because it obviously is promoting parallel development, right? Next is performance optimization, right? It can help optimize the performance of the front end application by providing, like we mentioned, specific APIs, which can basically deliver very customized required data to the specific front end application, right? So this reduces the amount of like unnecessary data transfer or overloading APIs to accommodate all kinds of front end application, right? So which can reduce like unnecessary data transfer processing, right? Which is basically an improvement in response times, right? Next is security. Security concerns can be addressed more effectively with a dedicated backend for front end, right? For each front end, right? Like access control, authentication mechanisms, like those can all be customized to match the specific requirement and the user roles, right, of the corresponding front end application. So security is again, it gives you an option, right? That is a benefit and advantage. And last but not least is scalability, right? It can be scaled independently based on the demand of specific front end applications, right? So this basically enables better resource allocation and scalability, like planning, right? So those are all important in terms of when you are building a large scale system, right? But there are few considerations that uh, you should take into account. First is how many backends, right? I mean, when you think about in that perspective, I mean, there can be several devices, and if you run the combinations and permutations of like all possibilities, I mean, there can be tens of backend systems and tens of front end applications, right? So how do you determine what is the right size? I mean, one size might not be the right size, but is two the right size? Is five the right size? So how do you cater to that? right? So that's a consideration that you should keep in mind. Code duplication, as you can understand, obviously if you have um, one backend serving all kinds of front end traffic, it is like one business logic. But if you have several different backend, the data and the API segregation and responsibilities, those are good. But in terms of the logic, right, how do you add a friend on Facebook? Whether you add a friend on Facebook on website, or you add a friend on Facebook on from your app, the backend logic of adding a friend to of a user is primarily the same. So there can be code duplication in that regard. So while making it modular, you might also want to think about how common functionalities can be broken out, and then only different functionalities can stay in different backend systems, which can then serve corresponding front end applications, right? Which again is a follow-up point to the code duplication is obviously the development time. I mean, if you are a startup and you want to go fast, you want to build fast, obviously, or if you have a critical time sensitive delivery in that way, I mean, obviously the time matters there, and time matters in business in general, right? So if you are planning this kind of a system, that really has to come from the requirements from the product, right? To be able to understand and create the kind of trade-offs and understand what are the benefits of going ahead with this approach, right? Otherwise, if you just go ahead with this approach blindly, I mean, you can end up creating like 5 backend services and 5 front end applications, right? And all separate maintenance, separate management. So those are all areas to consider, right? So that is backend for front end pattern. Hopefully this was useful.